Let's talk about some basics of sports graphic composition. So pretty much all sports graphics are going to have some combination of 5 different elements. You have a background, you have featured images, which might be the player cutouts or photos, you have text, you have logos, and finally you have overlays and textures. So let's start with making a new Photoshop document. Let's work with 1080 by 1350. This is the vertical format for Instagram. And let's start with background. So first up, let's just start with a solid color layer. This can be anything, black, white. You can also use a gradient overlay if you kind of want to make it fade out into darker edges. So we can do a black and white gradient, switch it to radial, and then increase the scale, maybe decrease the opacity a little bit. So now we have this kind of white and gray. So solid color layers, probably the most basic of backgrounds, and they can still be very effective. You can also drag in specific images to the backgrounds. These might be images related to the player or the team that you are going for. So we're going to be working with Jordan Kerr today. So we're going to go with some Salt Lake themed backgrounds. And I'm just going to drag in this photo. This is Salt Lake City, which I got off unsplash.com. It's a great free resource for stock images. Oftentimes background photos might be a little faded. You kind of want them more out of the way. So we're going to take down the opacity here. We're also going to switch the blend mode to luminosity, which is going to make it grayscale. And we just want like a subtle fade on our background layer. And that'll allow the player cutouts, which we'll go in and add now, to just stand out and pop out more from this background. So let's go in and add our featured images. We're gonna use some Jordan Kerr cutouts. This is a good one. You know, the featured images, this can be any number of player cutouts or player photos. We could look at like 3 to 5, maybe even 7 cutouts of different players stacked on top of each other. You could just have like a single player layout like this, and this might look better on just a blank background. We can go and give him some shadows real quick with our brush tool and shrinking those down, sizing them to his feet. And I won't get too detailed on these player cutouts, but we are just focused on composition mostly, but I still want to give you a good idea of how these finished images can look. So that's looking decent enough for now. So like I said, you might just have one featured image in your player poster. You might have multiple. You might have a big cutout behind the smaller one. So we can drag in a bigger Jordan Kerr cutout and mask out the bottom so he's kind of fading out. One thing I really don't like in designs is when a player has shadows and they're standing on something that doesn't make sense for them to be standing on. Like if I kept it like this and you could see his shadows better, it doesn't make sense that he's standing here on his other cutout. So I like to fade out the lower part of the back cutout. And if there's a background layer like this, again, it doesn't really make sense that he'd be standing on like the buildings and trees down here. So I might take a mask and brush out the bottom part of this image as well. And maybe we take out the buildings altogether. We just have this subtle mountain background. And let's size down these player cutouts just to give us a little bit more room to work with. Now let's move on to text. Text, again, is going to have a wide variety of applications and uses. You might have like big text going over the middle of the graphic. Like if we just write out Kerr like I have in my example at the start of this video, you could just have like big giant text. You could have repeating text too. So maybe we want the last name Kerr repeating a bunch of times. Oh, let me size this back. Decrease the space between lines. Also, text can definitely factor into the background, so keep that in mind too. Like these elements are going to kind of cross over, and you might have player images in the background too. It might not be just like a scenic view. So if we take Kerr's last name a bunch of times repeating, I think we're gonna keep it as just a single name for the purposes of this video, and we'll go ahead and center it. And now let's add another text layer on top and switch this one to stroke. And a 1 pixel stroke is good, and then decrease the fill all the way. That's how you get this text effect where you have the stroked letters going over the cutout just so we can read his last name. Now text can also just be small text on the top or bottom. So if we write out Jordan Kerr, Salt Lake Shred, increase the size so we can see it. And then maybe that's our title. Maybe you go to one line and put a little line between. And let's size this down. Change the color of this too. Maybe we want a black theme for this graphic. One thing you can do if you're playing around with the background, maybe we want this whole thing to be dark. You can take a gradient map and put it over whatever background layer you have. So if you go down to your adjustment layers, go to gradient map, and now pick, let's start with black and white, but let's change this white to just like a dark gray. You can quickly change the coloring of your background layer using gradient maps, which is super helpful. So we just went from a kind of a middle gray design to now a dark themed design. We can also change the colors of Kerr behind to a yellow, maybe. And change the stroke also to the yellow. We want those things to match to maximize this effect. And then I'm gonna change this to yellow as well. So we got a black and yellow themed graphic now. Next, let's talk logos. So logos, again, these can factor into the background. You might just have a giant shred logo that's just behind everything, and that can be a good effect and a good addition to the background. You know, you might fade it, decrease the opacity to help it blend in a little bit more. You can also just take a small logo and put it in the corner or at the bottom or top of the design. So in this case, let's just throw Salt Lake Shred at the bottom. Let's move up our player cutouts a little bit with the text just to give some more space. Okay, this is a pretty common look you'll see with the logo, just kind of small and out of the way, but still in a central position. It can be good to have a bigger logo if you're really trying to draw attention to the team, but I feel good about these cutouts that we have, and you have like this featured Salt Lake Shred logo on both Jordan Kerr images. So the last thing we want to talk about is textures and overlays. I always like to make a folder at the end and call it finishing. This is for what I think of as finishing touches to the design. First, I'm going to add a layer of grain, and I'm going to do that by going to 50% gray, filling that layer, switching it to smart filters, and then going to noise, add noise, and 7% looks about right. Then I'm going to change the blend mode to soft light. And you can see only really when you zoom in, but it gives just this overall texture to the design, further bringing everything together. We are also going to add in, let's see, got this chalk texture that might be interesting. So kind of the final touch with any design, and I should make an entire video about this, but just to like add textures and overlays and then switch the blend modes so that they show through a little bit. That's a little harsh, so we're gonna turn down the opacity there. But setting anything black with white specks on it to the blend mode screen, that's gonna help you get this textured effect. We can also add these dust scratches, which again, we got white speckles on a black background. Switch it to screen, we'll tone it down a little bit more. And you can just kind of stack these textures and overlays on at the end of whatever you're working on and see what happens. I recommend having like a dedicated folder for any textures you accumulate in your time as a designer. You can get stuff from unsplash.com, like I mentioned before. You can also go out and take pictures of things outside or of your desk, really of walls, whatever you want, and use those images in your designs. One more texture we might add is this light texture. I don't know how this is gonna look, but it's just kind of this gradient light, almost like a light leak or a film burn, kind of in that category. If you set that to screen, it kind of gives this this wash of blue and some rainbow coloring. You can also double click, like not on the name, but kind of in this dead space by the layer. You can also right click and go to blending options to pull up these blending options and adjust this blend if layer. And if you hold option, you can separate out this black marker. And that's basically just taking out the darker tones of whatever layer you are affecting this with. So I'm just going to bring the opacity down a little bit. And you can see the finishing touches before and after. This is with a bunch of textures on it, and before with no textures. The design is not bad without any textures, or maybe if we just had grain on there. You don't have to go crazy with textures and overlays, but just know that that is a good tool and an important step at the end of any design or adding to your background layer. So those are really the 5 components of any composition. Again, background, featured images, text, logos, and overlays and textures.